Hello and welcome to yet another edition of the Willy-Nilly show. Today we have again with us the senior journalist, Mr. Fred Weir, all the way from Moscow. So without much ado, let's add him.
Hi.
Good morning, sir, and good evening. So welcome back again. I wouldn't say that you've come here for the third time, because yesterday we were busy practicing Murphy's Law.
Yes, you had a technological perfect storm. Nothing worked.
Yeah, what can go wrong will go wrong. And that's exactly what happened yesterday. So, Mr. Weir, before we move on to discuss about Mr. Putin's two-day visit to India, there's something else which I want to discuss. In fact, you have covered it in your last article, which you wrote for Christian Science Monitor. So, this Ukraine war has been happening for the last 3.5 years. And what Russia has done in these 3.5 years is it has streamlined its banking system and the production system, defense production system. So much so that it has been churning out one weapon system after another, all state of the art and having a strategic advantage. It has got a lovely missile called Orishnik, then it produced a nuclear powered missile called Burevestnik. And then recently, as you have written in your article, they have launched a new nuclear-powered submarine, Khabarovsk, I think it's called. And apart from that, they've got a strategic torpedo called Poseidon. But in the same time, in the last 4 years or so, America hasn't done much. The last administration was pretty arrogant. They never wanted to even talk to Mr. Putin. And in the current administration, it's all about Trump's bragging. So what exactly is happening? I mean, why is the strategic balance shifting in Russia's favor? And if that's the case, why Europe is not ready to negotiate? The 28-piece plan, they are not wanting to do anything with it. And even the assets which are frozen, the Russian assets which are frozen in Brussels, apparently they want to use them to fund the Ukraine war. And that funny 100 Rafale deal that Ukraine signed with France, we know Ukraine has no money. So what is happening? It's all very funny business that's happening there.
Well, that's a lot of different things. First of all, let's deal with strategic balance. That is like the nuclear weapons that create the threat of total annihilation. And there's a very complicated Cold War strategic dance that was called MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction, which meant that nobody would dare to start a war because, yes, they could destroy the adversary, but the second strike by the adversary would destroy them, hence mutually assured destruction. So better work it out. Through negotiations, through foreign policy arrangements, which they did. We lived through the Cold War. I know you're a young guy, so maybe you don't remember it, but I grew up in that era of the balance of terror. I can remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was a kid at High Park Forest School in Toronto, and we were doing atomic safety drills, so-called, by being instructed to hide under our desks, cover our heads, as if that would protect us from a nuclear blast. But people took it very seriously, and the fear was real. So in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two superpowers, as they were then, they embarked slowly but surely on a process of what was called arms control. Various treaties, starting with the nuclear test ban, but moving on to strategic weapons, limiting their number. And it reached a sort of height in 1987 when Gorbachev and Reagan signed a treaty banning an entire class of medium-range missiles. But one of the key arms control treaties that they did sign in 1972 was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which prevented them from either side from developing anti-missile weapons. They were allowed to have one site or something complicated. But the basic idea was, if one side started going down this road of being able to fight off a nuclear attack with anti-missile weapons, it meant they could launch a first strike against their adversary and then deal with any second strike that the adversary fired back with anti-missile weapons. It was a very dangerous, destabilizing idea, so they banned that entire class of weapons. And it worked. All my life, I mean, I was born sort of at the dawn of the Cold War in 1951. Yeah. And so I lived through the entire, every episode of it. And I have the most sharp memories of how that was. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union and disappearance of one superpower, it changed. I mean, the political atmosphere changed. It was no longer everyday tension, but the nuclear arsenals remained. And about 25 years ago, George W. Bush abandoned the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and started on developing anti-missile weapons. It was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, I think one of the key factors was that the United States no longer regarded Russia as a serious adversary. It still had the nuclear weapons, but they felt they could manage it in other ways, and that the era, post-Soviet era, would be one of Western hegemony, particularly the United States, a unipolar moment.
I just want to interrupt you for a brief second. I just want you to rewind a bit. When I was a little kid, I used to read about Star Wars program, the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, and then all of a sudden, it was shelved. So why was it shelved by the United States? Because I think during the Cold War, it became a huge issue in the late 80s.
It wasn't shelved. It was never shelved. It simply was Ronald Reagan's vision of an umbrella protecting the United States. He even had imagery, if I remember the television spot that he did announcing it. He even had a sort of an image of an umbrella and nuclear missiles bouncing off of it. It was far ahead of its time. It was really a propaganda stunt, which worked, by the way. The Russians believed it. The Soviets were terrified by it because it would completely nullify their strategic deterrent. And that was, of course, as you say, the beginning of the end of arms control. It took a long time for it to unwind, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States gradually became unilateral in its arms build-up and its strategic thinking, and disregarded Russia and that whole bilateral Cold War framework of negotiation. And that's the world we live in very much now. And so I'm taking a long route to answering your question, but about these new weapons that Putin has announced, they are decades in the making. They didn't just pop up.
Right.
Actually, after Bush pulled out of the ABM treaty, Russia started seriously working on these. I suspect they're all old Soviet designs, but they are unique technologies that would defeat anti-missile systems. See, one is a nuclear torpedo, a robot. It's not a torpedo. It's a sort of drone, underwater drone,
Oh,
powerful one that would carry could carry a nuclear warhead and destroy cities from under the sea,
yeah.
port cities.
Yeah.
Another one is a nuclear-powered cruise missile with unlimited range, so it could approach its target from any direction. It could go by any circuitous route. So
Buravestnik you're talking about,
the
right?
Buravestnik is again an extraordinary technology. The nuclear.
But that's a cruise missile. That's not a ballistic missile, right?
No, it's a cruise missile. It can presumably fly very low under radar screens, but its specific superpower, as if you like, is that it has unlimited range. It can be in the air for any amount of time, fly around the world, and come from a completely unexpected direction. So it too is something that would thwart any standard missile defense system. And the third one is, of course, the Buravestnik, not the Buravestnik, just blocking on the name, the hypersonic missile. Shit. Oreshnik, yes, thank you very much. The Oreshnik, which flies at 10 times the speed of sound.
It's got 6 warheads, splits into 6, and then
it's a ballistic missile, but it flies, and it can release 6 warheads that can be independently targeted, and they can maneuver. You see, and missile defense, at least as far, even with supercomputers and all the systems that they have nowadays, and were very far advanced over the 1980s when Ronald Reagan first proposed this, still, the problem of missile defense is like hitting a bullet with a bullet. And when you have this Oreshnik missile going at the speeds that it is, it's very fast. But when the warheads they sort of released and they come down, they can move around, and that makes, if you had a maneuverable bullet, that makes the problem hundreds of times more difficult, how to hit it. So anyway, for the time being, and Putin even said for the rest of the century, Russia's second strike capability, the ability to hit back after a first strike, seems assured, as long as these weapons really work. As advertised, we don't know that they do. But I wouldn't underestimate the Russians. This is something that has been going around for a long time, the tendency to think that Russia is a basket case. The post-Soviet Russia can't tie its own shoelaces, can't do things, you hear it and you hear it again, even now. Yeah, I'm not quite sure where that comes from, because Russia is the rump of the former Soviet Union, and the former Soviet Union had vast industrial capability and scientific potential.
Forget
power.
Yeah, forget just one thing. Just forget about scientific. People. When it comes to arts and culture, Russia has always been the leading force. Their literature is number 1 in the world. Look at their ballet. Look at the Bolshoi theater. I mean, it has always been a center of art and culture. So I don't know why.
We're talking about its economic potential, economic, strategic potential. And all of the industrial and engineering capabilities were there. And so, especially when this recent war broke out, all the predictions that sanctions will wreck Russia and Russia can't possibly match the industrial power of the West, and all the stuff that people said, I wondered where they were getting it. And I think I have a theory about this. Among the fact that there is a certain amount of arrogance in the West and among Americans in particular. They tend to think they're the best at everything and nobody else can match them. But most of the advisors, and of course senior journalists as well, most of the people who are today advising Western governments about Russia and writing about Russia are people who got their direct experience with Russia in the 1990s after the Soviet collapse. Russia, I remember because I lived through it, Russia filled up with foreigners. There was hundreds of foreign correspondents in Russia, hundreds of advisors, academic, I mean, just so many people, and you see their names. I knew many of them, and I see their names now in high positions. And it seems to me that because Russia was in the 1990s a basket case, it was run by oligarchs, it was a mess. That's the Russia they remember, and they think it's still like that. And even though they must have been keeping up with the news, they haven't lived through the Putin era. And as I have, for example, the Putin era saw a mass rebounding of Russia. It came back in so many ways, economically, financially, scientifically, gradually, slowly, but it really bounced back in a big way. And there's no way you can explain how Russia has survived almost 4 years of intense sanctions, like the most intense barrage of sanctions ever imposed on a country. And they, I wouldn't say they brushed it off, but they sailed through it. They changed, they developed a lot of import substitution. I know I see that a lot. They've changed their partners, supply chains, everything. And the Russian consumer economy is, I wouldn't say it's booming or anything, but it's fine. It's carrying on after almost 4 years of war. And that, you know, and what I see, when I see these headlines, and there's one particular doozy in The Guardian today, I was reading it by Timothy Carton-Ash, who's one of those people who knew Russia well in the 1990s, talking about how Putin is finished. The walls are closing in on him. I just, so anyway, this Russia is a new Russia. And the other thing I don't think people have quite taken on board is that it's a capitalist country. They still think it's communism or something. But the Soviet economy didn't compete. It had its strengths, you know. It industrialized the whole country, modernized it in a certain form, but it did so at great cost. And at the end of the day, it simply couldn't compete with the West. You know, when I was younger in the 1980s, I several times crossed over that wall in Berlin from east to west Berlin. And, you know, there was just no way you couldn't notice, realize, you know, first of all, two completely different universes, different planets, you know, but you could see which one was richer, happier, more, more survivable. And it wasn't the East. And everything to the east of Berlin was sort of like that. And everything to the west, or West Germany, was prosperous, free, energetic, dynamic. So the history. I mean, I lived through that history, so I've taken it. You know, I've taken it to heart. But the thing is, I often want to take some of my colleagues and shake them and say, "Look, come to Moscow and look around, for heaven's sake. It looks like West Berlin did. It's a modern, bustling, capitalist market economy, and not only that, the Russian people, who in Soviet times were cynical, did not believe anything their leaders told them. I can well remember the attitude, the blasé attitude of people when the Soviet Union was collapsing. Their state was crumbling under their feet. They didn't give a shit. And it was just mass apathy about that. it was the culmination of years of Soviet failure and dysfunction. There's nothing like that anymore. The average Russian is sort of patriotic. They even this war, this horrible, awful war. I'm not saying anybody is enthusiastic about it. At least I don't know anybody who is. But they accept it, and they accept Putin's narrative that we're not fighting Ukraine, we're fighting the United West, and we have to win this because otherwise Russia will be put down. I mean, this is the narrative. Whether you believe it or not, it only matters that the majority of Russians seem to have bought it and accept it, and they accept this war is a price they have to pay. So we're coming. I'm not sure where we are in terms of unraveling your question. If you want to,
But there's something which I'm really curious to know from you is that the time frame that we're talking about, let's say last 10 years or 20 years when Russia was developing all these new missile systems. And all I hear from the American side in terms of missiles is when I was a kid, I was in school around the first Gulf War. They were talking in terms of Tomahawks and Patriots. And they're still using Tomahawks and Patriots, which are not proving to be, worthwhile during war. So why is it that Russia has been able to produce so much and they have been sitting pretty, though they have come up with different kinds of things, other fields, but still, why is America lagging so far behind Russia when they take Russians seriously as a contemporary, let's say, enemy?
well, this is the thing. I don't think they do. As I said, I think they have failed to take Russia seriously. And in the 1990s, one of the attitudes behind NATO expansion, as I seem to remember, was the feeling that Russia can't do anything about it. Russia's a basket case. Russia's hopeless. They may huff and puff, but they can't do anything about it. We're in the driver's seat. We'll do this. And a few very good Russia hands like George Kennan warned strenuously about it. Even in the 90s when Russia was helpless, they couldn't stop the first and second wave of NATO expansion and had to swallow it. Even then, even Boris Yeltsin, who wasn't even completely sober all the time, did say some very strong things about the long-term threat and danger of NATO expansion. So anyway, Putin in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference gave a speech, and it took him 7 years. He was in power for 7 years, and he was trying to find a modus vivendi with the West. It was his plan A to integrate with the Western-led order, the so-called rules-based order. This was what Russia aspired to do in Putin's first term. But things like the unilateral withdrawing from the ABM treaty, the Iraq War, other things really cooled Russia off about that. But nothing more serious than NATO expansion in the Russian mind. By that time, by 2007, the West was looking at Ukraine and Georgia as the next NATO members.
Yes.
And Putin said it. You can go back and read that speech because it's prophetic in a way. It was a cry for help from Putin, a cry for understanding, but he was saying pretty clearly that these are Russia's red lines. NATO expansion cannot expand into Ukraine. And I don't know why they didn't listen to him. And again, I think it's just because the attitude was Russia doesn't matter. Who gives a shit what they think?
And he had absolutely no problems about Ukraine being a part of the EU. He was only talking about NATO in particular.
Well, there were problems with because I mean, he didn't. They we're okay. Changing the focus a little bit, but the EU did move right up to the borders of Ukraine. Poland joined in 2004, the Baltic states, and Poland transformed very rapidly with huge amount of EU investment in its infrastructure and revamping it, all its standards. And
Yeah,
that's where the conflict, the present conflict in Ukraine started there. When Yanukovych won the election in 2003. Yeah. Yeah. And there was this Orange Revolution, which took place in the Maidan in Kiev.
Yeah.
And there was a huge demonstration. I covered this. And it was basically, Kiev is a city of 3 million people. And there were never more than a couple 100,000 people on the square. But that's a huge number of people. But it's still a minority. It's not the equivalent of an election, which is, but anyway, that ended with a compromise. The election was fought, and a liberal, Yushchenko, narrowly won. It was like the country was split 50-50, basically, between the Party of Regions, the sort of what they call pro-Russian side, and the Ukrainian, pro-Ukrainian, whatever you want to call it. But Yushchenko won, and then it followed several years of stagnation and corruption. And the thing's built to a climax again. And part of can I explain part of the forces, the underlying forces there, mainly Ukraine. Ukraine is I think we discussed this in our last conversation. So Ukraine, very divided place, at least two fundamentally different zones. And they voted. You could tell by just looking at electoral maps of all those elections. You can tell they voted in opposite ways, east and west. But the prosperity in Poland had a huge effect in Western Ukraine, where the country remained poor and corrupt, and it didn't make any economic progress during these years after 2004. But Ukrainians could go to Poland and see how the country was being transformed. And they said, well, they would say, well, look, this is the future. But in Eastern Ukraine, Russian-speaking, sort of Russia-oriented, people would go to Russia and work as guest workers. My own son grew up with a Ukrainian nanny, a lady from Luhansk. She was with us for 20 years. There were just millions of Ukrainian workers in Russia, which also went through a transformation during those years. It became a modern, relatively, and I would stress it, relatively prosperous, by Russian standards, place, much more coherent country. And so in Eastern Ukraine, they could see their future as being something like Russia. And they certainly wanted to keep the borders open and continue the relationship with Russia. This is one of the things in Eastern Ukraine, where everybody has relatives on both sides of the border, and everybody is used to there being no border there at all from their childhood, being able to go back and forth, speak the same language. At the same time, and as you were saying, there was something of a cultural revolution taking place in Russia. Theater, movies, TV shows, literature, a lot of stuff that is reflective of a growing dynamic society was coming out, and in eastern Ukraine, people oriented on that. Um, so those fundamental differences, well, they might have been resolved um, if there were peace in Europe. If there had been, if Ukraine had had 50 years, say, of peace and quiet to sort of knit that disparate country into one sort of united, diverse but united state. But it didn't. The Orange Revolution in 2004 disrupted things badly, and the one in 2014 was much more traumatic. And in Moscow, uh, the arrival of a government, and in a very disorderly way, it was not, again, it doesn't matter how many people they had on the Maidan, it was a fraction of the population of Kiev, much less the country. It was a small militant minority, mostly bussed in from Western Ukraine, where people are politically mobile and very militant.
And then CIA and other MI6, these intelligence agencies take advantage of who they.
Well, yeah, I don't, but see, I'm trying to explain, I don't think that the CIA or American or Western meddling explains it. It was Ukrainian. It was a fundamentally Ukrainian upheaval. It's just that it was aggravated by the presence on one side of the EU and NATO expressing one future, beckoning with one future, and Russia on the other side beckoning. And that's why there's, I usually hate to use labels like pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian. But in this case, there was a geopolitical split in the country. And there's some sense to those kind of labels. But still, it was basically Ukrainian, nest. And I say that as someone who's half Ukrainian myself. It was absolutely a homegrown conundrum that was badly aggravated from outside, and nobody gave it peace and quiet. And it has to be said that on the side of the Ukrainian nationalists, that is, mainly people from the west of Ukraine, the part that's known as Galicia, it's like the motherland of my grandparents. They immigrated to Canada in 1902. They really, really militant about Ukrainianization. They have all these facile arguments like that, country isn't a country if it has different languages. You have to have one language, one government, federal government, or central government, unitary state, and they avoided any compromises that would have recognized the sort of multicultural, multilingual nature of Ukraine, and have create institutions that work with that and respect that. And one of the supreme ironies of that is that the European Union, which they wish to join, does have very strong rules about protecting minority languages and minority cultures. The era of militant nationalism is long past in Western Europe, and they created a union that respects every little tiny minority. And Ukraine, at least the Ukraine envisaged by the nationalists, is more like 19th century Germany or Italy, where they want to homogenize the country in a Ukrainian form by using the central government, the powers of the government, education system, media, to get everybody speaking Ukrainian and thinking Ukrainian and subscribing to one version of Ukrainian history. And so these are the underlying drivers of this conflict.
Yeah.
And as we're supposed to be discussing here, it does take place in this incredibly unstable geopolitical environment.
So, it's quite funny that last year, during the height of the war in Ukraine, the Europeans and the Americans didn't even have, enough 150 shells. America couldn't provide them. So when you take into context all these things, it's very funny that the Europeans want to scupper the peace plan of Mr. Trump. And I don't know why they're wanting to do it, because they want to go on and on with the war, because I think there's a lot of money to be made in the war. And what the question that I want to ask you is, will the Europeans be successful in using the frozen assets in Brussels of Russia to fund the Ukraine war? Because Russians have won them, and even Brussels is quite tentative about it. They don't want to do it because it will have legal repercussions.
I don't know the answer to that. We'll have an answer in a couple of weeks. There's going to be a big meeting, I think, on the 18th of December, in which they will try to float a plan. It'll be some complicated thing, not seizing the assets outright, which would be kind of like Bolshevism, wouldn't it? Ironically, but some loan or bonds backed by these assets. I don't know. There's a lot of resistance in Europe because it would be utterly illegal. But it also, my thinking is, it's desperate. It's perfectly clear that even when the United States was under Biden was completely on side in this effort to support Ukraine, and all the financial resources of the United States were being poured into this effort, the war was still being lost gradually, slowly by Ukraine. The handwriting has been on the wall since that failed offensive in the summer of 2023. It's been clear that Ukraine isn't going to retake any territory from Russia. It's only recently become crystal clear that the Russians are advancing on every front, and the Ukrainian army is slowly sliding toward collapse. But without the United States and Trump, we can discuss Trump's new national security doctrine if you like.
We'll that is also there. And in fact, that's what I'm saying. There has been a division between the Europeans and the Americans, because
the Americans are off the train. They're not going to be financing Ukraine.
Yeah, they've clearly told the NATO that you have to get conventional weapons. Yeah.
So and it's a question of whether they'll sell arms now. But the point is, Europe has stepped up rhetorically and are making loud noises about how they'll do it. But you're looking at the three ringleaders of this coalition of the willing, are Germany, France, and Britain. And these are three countries in the throes of political crisis and also economically on the back foot, where they have not, even with the full assistance of the United States, they did not succeed in bringing Ukrainian victory. How Europe is going to do it alone, and many European countries are opting out. You can see the disunity on full display. It's sort of sad. But I can't think how European populations will accept the burden of paying. What is it? It's got a huge amount of money to Ukraine every year just to keep it afloat. vast numbers. They say they need next year 140 billion euros.
But apparently they have a lot of money because they are trying to investigate an embezzlement case in the energy sector to the tune of $250 million.
Yeah. The corruption in Ukraine is another story, but just where the money will come from, if European taxpayers have to put it up, is just, no. So therefore, these Russian assets are very seductive. The idea of just taking this money, it seems morally sound, like take from the aggressor and give to the victim. And they're likening it to reparations, like that Russia will pay back the money through reparations when they lose the war. I mean, there's a lot of things that don't work, but the urge to seize this money, to get a hold of it somehow and give it to Ukraine is overpowering. So I wouldn't exclude that they will come up with some scheme to do so.
Yeah, and maybe that 100 French fighter deal is going to materialize with that money.
I have no idea what that was about. Zelensky also went to Sweden and signed a deal to buy 100 big fighters there. Like, these are planes that would be built over the next 10 years. They're not like sitting on the lot waiting to be shipped to Ukraine, even if they have the money. Yeah. So I have no idea what that's about. It's a sidelight.
Yeah, but it's sad that the peace is nowhere to be seen. I mean, they are trying to scupper it because the Europeans don't want peace. Apparently, the Americans want it. Mr. Putin wants it, but they don't want it.
I think that I follow this peace process very closely every single day, and I have to say that it's making progress. No negotiation, serious negotiation, especially to settle conflict in the scope of this one, can be done in a day. I mean, again, Vietnam, I came of age during Vietnam, and I suppose you weren't born yet, but in 1968, Richard Nixon was elected, promising to make peace, get peace with honor, he called it, in Vietnam, and did indeed open up negotiations with the North Vietnamese in Paris. Those negotiations went on for 5 years, while the war raged on before a peace deal was signed. But the United States had recognized as early as 1968 that the war was unwinnable. But they kept throwing resources and human beings into that maelstrom. I well remember the death count went up after Nixon promised peace. So this peace process is going a little faster, and it is a different kind of war. I think it has to be recognized that Vietnam was an unwinnable war for the United States. Didn't matter how much money and power they had. It was a distant country, completely alien place where everybody hated them. You're dealing here with Ukraine, where half the country hates the Russians, that's for sure. The other country, half is paralyzed. What's happening in eastern Ukraine is hellish. And I don't mean to be callous by mentioning history, but the Russians have been fighting and winning wars on that land, eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper River, for almost 400 years. And this is the third big one in just over a century. Every Civil War, World War II, and now this one. This is the smallest of the three. But every single time, those lands have been reincorporated into the Moscow-led state. It's not like Vietnam. The people there are Russian-speaking, no matter what anyone tries to tell you. They're overwhelmingly Russian-speaking. and as I was saying earlier, sort of oriented on Russia. They never, during the years of Ukrainian independence since 1990, have developed a strong Ukrainian identity. It doesn't mean that they're Russians. They are different than they always were. In Soviet times, Ukraine was sort of a different place from Russia. I know I traveled widely. I lived 5 years in the Soviet Union, and I traveled, through Ukraine a lot. Um, but uh, the task of Russia, once they've taken these lands and integrated them into Russia, will not be that hard. It's not even something like Algeria or Ireland. It's a post-imperial kind of a situation. It's tragic, and it should never have happened.
Yeah.
But now that it has, and Russia is totally committed, I have no doubts that they will reincorporate those lands into Russia, and that lots and lots of Ukrainians they will rebuild them. This is another thing that people sort of deny. How are they going to rebuild them when they get all the money? Um,
Just, just one thing I want to ask before we move on to the second topic. Who will sign the peace treaty if it happens on behalf of Ukraine? Because Putin has quite clearly said that he doesn't want to talk to Zelensky because he's not a legally elected leader of Ukraine, and they should hold an elections there.
The peace plan that Trump, the first one, I don't know what they're talking about now because they're quite wisely keeping it secret. But the first one did call for Ukrainian elections within 100 days. But it is assumed that Zelensky will sign. And I know Putin has been cagey about this, and Russians say quite rightly that his mandate expired. But it's martial law. And Zelensky was freely and fairly elected. I was there. I covered the election in Ukraine in 2019. He was overwhelmingly elected by almost 3/4 of the Ukrainian voters. And so he's the closest thing to a legitimate leader the country has. And I know that, it's wartime and there's war propaganda, and the Russians fire all kinds of guns in this information war. But really, I'm pretty sure that when it comes right down to it, Putin will accept Zelensky's signature on the final document. And then perhaps once peace is established, elections will take place in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian people will have to ratify that peace agreement.
Okay. So let's move on to the second topic, which was actually the main topic for today. So regarding President Putin's two-day India visit on December 4th and 5th for the annual bilateral Indo-Russia summit. Now, what I want to ask you is your views. Like, most of the legacy media channels, both in India and outside of India, have been just harping on the fact that this was just a routine visit about trade and arms deal and oil deal. And Mr. Putin made it very clear, no, I'm not here to talk about arms. And I know it's a long-term strategy that they are trying to, hatch out a long-term plan. So your views on that, and like what was happening there, because his body language was absolutely comfortable, and there was something really cooking up there.
Well, first of all, it is an old relationship, solid, reliable, has a lot of historical, substance to it. And like all relationships, it's changed a lot. And it does face a lot of new challenges. And I think that's what Putin and Modi as well aim to address. First of all, one of the specters hanging over the meeting is that of Donald Trump, who is, putting all kinds of pressure on both leaders. So a lot of that, what you saw, the real close bonhomie and all that, was a signal to Washington. But there's a tremendous amount of substance to it that does bring it to, if they follow through, and there's no reason to suspect that they wouldn't, does bring the relationship to a new level. I mean, yes, arms, a big factor there. It isn't just about arms and oil, but it definitely was about arms and oil, among other things. But a lot of things that Putin brought was a new Russian attitude, not entirely new, but a willingness to engage India in a direct way with joint ventures, bringing Russia's best technologies and sharing them with India in joint ventures. Whether, for instance, they're going to make the Sukhoi 100 superjet.
Yeah.
I think Hal, the aeronautics firm, is going to build it under license, but it involves a lot of technology sharing. I mean, India doesn't make its own airliners,
Yeah.
And Russia will be giving it basically the entry-level capability to do so. That's a big deal, and given the national economic strategy that Modi has pursued, I believe he calls it "Make in India." That really is a big deal, and if the Russians would do that in other sectors, for instance, there's talk, and it's just speculative, I don't know, but talk about maybe the S-500.
S-500. That is also, they're trying to do joint production in India.
Yeah, they're talking about it. I don't know if any deals were signed. The S-500 isn't ready for prime time yet anyway. But there's also the Su-57, the stealth fighter Russians have. It probably isn't the equal to the F-35. The United States is still the premier technological hub of the world, and its arms are the most sophisticated. But there's zero chance that the Americans are going to let the Indians build the F-35 in India and acquire the technology, right? Whereas the Russians will talk about it. They're far more willing to share on that level. And Putin seems to have brought a lot of that. Another thing that Putin did bring, and this is surprising, and if it works, it will change things in Russia, is a willingness to admit Indian workers, not just skilled, but top skilled workers. And let's face it, most of the most skilled Indian workers.
I'm glad you're broaching on that subject, because that was a key factor: jobs/immigration, and also they want to train them in the Arctic, because the Ukraine war partly is about the riches in the Arctic. So they want to train Indian workers, because he has apparently made it very clear, he and the Japanese leaders, that they require workers. I think he said he needs close to 1 million Indian workers in Russia.
Yes, see, Russia has a severe labor shortage.
Yeah,
it has a long-term demographic crisis.
Their birth rate has fallen way below 2.1%.
And it has a very, very tight and restrictive immigration policy.
Yeah.
I know this because I am a foreigner living in Russia. I don't have Russian citizenship. And I have to renew my documentation all the time. It's getting easier simply because I've now got the golden document. It's called a Vidna Жительство. It's open-ended, permanent residency. But still, I have to jump through all kinds of hoops, and every year. And if I were from a third world country, it would be 10 times harder. I know I've seen this. Even Central Asian workers, who were most of the migrant workers in Russia, people from like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, not so much Kazakhstan, but Tajikistan, these places, and they're Russian speaking because they're Soviet legacy, and still they live in such legal limbo and harsh conditions. I mean, it's not nice. And it's because Russia is not a place where which is easily accepting of outsiders. So I say this as a cautionary to the bright horizon that Putin offered. But what is mainly important is that they streamline their migration system, make it possible for people to come on work permits that are legal, can withstand, when a policeman stops you, you can show them that document and you're good. That it has to work. And in that case, Russia would be prepared to accept, I think they're saying 800,000 or more Indian semi-skilled workers. I've heard, I haven't met any of these people yet, but I've heard there's a textile factory in Ivanovo, which is sort of north of Moscow. It's a traditionally textile center, which has started up a company which will be manned by Indian workers. So it's a company, they must be arranging documents for their workers. And, there's a lot of problems solved when you have large numbers of guest workers coming to a country. But Putin said that they're going to do it. And indeed, Russia's war, the war has really exacerbated Russia's labor shortage. Skilled workers are in great demand. And so Indian skilled workers would be welcome as well, I'm guessing. But generally, they go west, don't they? If you're a doctor or IT technician, you can go to America, or maybe not anymore, but Canada was always open and a much better place to go to than Russia. If you're, but down the road, this is possible, and it would help. It would really help Russia's economy, because when the war is over, and let us hope it soon will be, they're going to have a huge economic project of rebuilding those newly acquired territories. It's going to absorb a huge amount of resources and manpower. And they're going to need workers, all kinds of them. And so, and I started to say this, I have no doubts that Russia will rebuild those territories. They're already starting to. If Russian TV is to be believed, I watched a documentary about the rebuilding in Mariupol the other day, and I know Mariupol. I've been there. I spent time there. Know the city. It was almost completely destroyed in 2022 in the battle. But now you see it. You recognize places that have risen from the ashes. The Russians have built a new railroad to Mariupol. They're rebuilding the city, and they're very serious about this, about keeping these places and Russifying them. Whether you approve of that or not, that's what they're going to do. And there are precedents. Think of Chechnya. Chechnya was destroyed in 2 wars. The last time I was in Grozny, it was 2004, the place looked like Stalingrad. It looked like a moonscape. Now I haven't been back there, but all accounts suggest that it's risen from the ashes. It's like Phoenix-like. It looks like Abu Dhabi now. And
there was a drone strike a couple of days ago. Ukraine.
Yeah, because the Ukrainians particularly hate the Chechens. And one of the reasons, and I was going to mention this, is that I can remember people saying after Chechnya was finally pacified, the Chechens will hate the Russians for 1,000 years. Russia has acquired this little black hole that will be a drain on it. Well, Chechnya has contributed 20,000 troops to the Russian war effort in Ukraine, and apparently they fight really well for Russia. So So much for that. Um, anyway, India, as a solid, good old friend of Russia, is a natural partner, even for things like that. Much more so than China, I would say, for temporary workers. India has much more experience with this, sending workers abroad, or having workers go abroad to the Persian Gulf and places on a temporary basis. It's more of a thing Indians do. And Russia is not a poor country. It can afford to pay decent wages, and it can afford to provide decent standards for workers. It does need to reform its immigration laws. And I wrote this. If you read my article, I quoted an Indian scholar saying that. But Putin as much as said it himself when he was in India. So clearly that's something that's on the agenda.
Yeah, and also Mr. Putin is 73 years old. He might be thinking in terms of who his successor would be and where he wants to take this relationship, thinking in long term. Because I think few of the things that were definitely discussed during the discussions with the Indian counterparts was the long-term vision vis-a-vis China, because Russia is wary of China. It does not want China to become the superpower in a bipolar world with America, because I think America is doing all kind of hanky-panky with China. So I want to discuss with you the Russia's aspirations in the Indo-Pacific, Eurasia with India, and because as you know, during this meeting between India and Russia, Chennai to Vladivostok, that sea route was discussed. And equally important is that Netanyahu was supposed to visit before or maybe after Putin, but he cancelled his visit because the top thing on the agenda of the Israeli Prime Minister would have been trying to facilitate the IMAC route. So I want to talk to you about that, because these were, I think, some of the most important things, because they have to keep China in check.
Well, that's really speculative, but there are various routes. This is a big thing, transport corridors. And the North Sea route is I mean, it's a long-term thing. It depends on global warming, and it depends on icebreakers. I'm just actually writing about this, about the Arctic. And I'm not sure what kind of pitch India made, or Putin made to India about this, but that did involve maybe construction.
It cuts down the days considerably. It takes only 14 days versus it take the.
Yeah, but see, India is closer to the Suez Canal than China or Japan. But anyhow, the route through Iran, Azerbaijan, to link up with the Russian railway network, which is very big and powerful and extensive. This route is going to be completed in a couple of years. It's one rail link in Iran is being rebuilt, and it's being built, and it's being built with Russian money. So the Russians have put a lot of effort into this, and that route will be awfully important for Indian-Russia trade, because it's just a matter of shipping things to a port on the Arabian Sea, Arabian Ocean. See, okay. Anyway, in southern Iran, getting on trains going all the way to the Russian railway network, where they could head east or west. This is a major corridor that the Russians are working on. The North Sea route is a long-term thing, but the Russians do see it as critical to the future and the development of the Arctic. And as Trump recently complained, Russia already has 48 icebreakers, and the United States has just one. And the Russians are building more. They're building a lot more bigger ones, nuclear powered, icebreakers. So they're investing and doubling down on development in the Arctic. This is a very big deal for Russia in the long term. And I think they do want to get other countries involved. India, China is already horning in on this and wants to be part of it. But India could well be part of it. It could figure heavily in India's own, you know, uh, um, development as a global power. But also the United States. You know, one of the things that is being discussed under this Trump peace plan, the 28 points or whatever it is now, there is a parallel diplomatic process going on, spearheaded by Kirill Dmitriev and Steve Witkoff, both of whom are businessmen. Dmitriev is, in fact, an alumni of Goldman Sachs, educated in the United States, and now he's one of Putin's top advisors. I'll bet that's never happened before. But it tells you just how important this developing this relationship with the United States is to the Kremlin right now. And one of the things they're talking about is Arctic cooperation. The gas and oil fields come to Trump's mind immediately. But there's a lot in the Arctic. And if, sadly, the ice is receding, it means that huge resources will open up in the Russian zone of economic, whatever they call it, preference. So influence, whatever they call it. But there is a 200-kilometer zone where the country has economic priority. And if you go 200 kilometers north from the coast of Siberia, you're practically at the North Pole. So that means Russia has a huge future in the Arctic. And if they're willing to share it with other countries, big countries who will invest, develop it, bring and use it, this is really hopeful thing, because it will help. What we need to think about. I mean, this is. I'm going to let you go now because I've talked for more than an hour. But one of the things we have to think about is the world of the future after this Ukraine war is over. Is it going to be a world of conflict, like the 1930s or something? Or is it going to be a new level of peace and prosperity? And what Putin is doing with India and trying to negotiate with the United States would aim toward the latter idea, a world where countries cooperate and trade and make profits, because it's all about capitalism, but a world that's essentially peaceful. That's what we need.
Yeah, so what do you think? It's going to be a bipolar world with the US and China as the superpowers, or ultimately we'll have a multipolar world that they're talking about?
No, it's going to be a multipolar world. It already is. I promised to mention Trump's new national security doctrine, but go and read it. Of course, it's America first, but it also claims a sphere of influence for the United States in the Western Hemisphere. It's not a new thing, but there's a Trump version of that, of the Monroe Doctrine. But also it concedes, basically, spheres of influence to other powers. It's basically rowing back American global hegemony to the Western Hemisphere. And therefore, we're looking at a polycentric or multipolar world, which already is in the process of being born, and it can't be stopped. But you see in that doctrine a lot of signs that American strategic thinkers are starting to accept it.
Okay, so another important thing, which talking about de-dollarization. they have allowed Russia and India both. India has also allowed the Russian traders to open rupee accounts in India, and they can also invest in the stocks, the rupee terms. So that is a huge headache that has gone for the Russians because they didn't know what to do with the rupees. So
Yeah.
yeah, that will facilitate de-dollarization if at all it will happen. I mean, I don't know when it's going to happen.
Well, it's already because the Russians have developed huge bank accounts, rupee bank accounts in India due to the oil sales
Yeah,
of the past couple of years. But an important element of that is that India is going to accept the Russian payment system. Russia has a national payment system. The Mir system is called, with its own credit cards, and they're valid mostly in Russia and a few other surrounding countries. You can't go to Western Europe and use your Mir card, and nowadays you can't be in Russia and use your MasterCard or Visa card. They're just incompatible systems. And it's a very big deal if India will accept the Mir card as payment. So a Russian tourist can go to India with his Russian credit card, pay for everything. This is a huge step toward facilitating trade. And of course, the trade will be in rubles and rupees, not dollars.
That'll be good. I mean, that's something which is huge. So I was noticing something. The entire delegation was wearing masks, and I read this news that apparently there's been a flu outbreak in the far east of Russia, and also in Spain. Yesterday, the hospitals were overflowing with people with flu. So, is this some kind of a biological weapon that has happened in the east side of Russia?
Flu epidemics are perennial. You know, I've lived through several of them. We think about COVID and the lockdowns, the panic response that governments had. But I can remember the year 1969. I was just around, I was 18 or so. It was a mass flu, really virulent flu that killed 500,000 people in North America.
Yeah.
And we didn't lock down or do social distancing or anything. In fact, we had Woodstock in 1969, and we healthy people got over the flu. I don't remember whether I had it or not, but it killed a lot of elderly people, children. So I wouldn't I really be careful about biological weapons, because I know that it's always there, and there's a lot of laboratories where people are experimenting with bugs. Mostly, I mean, they experiment with them mostly to learn, not to make weapons. I hope they're not making weapons, but it's dangerous enough. There was a lot of rumors about COVID and all that. I would just be careful about that, because epidemics happen, man. And flu has been around for a long time, and it keeps coming back in new forms. That's the thing about the flu virus. It mutates very quickly, and occasionally one comes along that's really deadly. Maybe that's happening now. I sure hope not.
It went all the way to Spain. Yesterday there was news of Spain. The hospitals are overflowing with patients.
Yes. Fun fact: the Spanish flu that was the worst flu epidemic
Yeah,
in all of history in 1918. It didn't originate in Spain at all. It originated in the United States. I don't know why it got this name, Spanish flu. The Spaniards they just hate that, because it wasn't even their flu. But anyhow, yes, flu happens, and
everyone, all the members of the delegation were wearing the masks. So I found it very strange because nobody has been wearing it of late. So, and then I read the news about the flew in and
No.
Yeah.
I don't know. And flu, it usually has an epicenter where it
Yeah.
starts.
it's in the
And
east of Russia.
Maybe, or but China, not to point fingers, but China is such a cauldron of humanity. It's so many people there. The bugs get started in like where you have so many people living cheek by jowl in one place. Infections can get started and spread very fast. So when you say the Russian Far East, it doesn't seem like a place where a bug would start and spread very quickly. But just to the southwest of it, China definitely is.
Yeah, and another interesting thing which you might have also heard in one of the interviews that he gave to an Indian channel, President Putin said that, basically called out American hypocrisy. They said that he said that America has been buying uranium and plutonium from us, and then they are reprimanding India for buying Russian oil. And also one interesting fact is then he just reiterated it when he came to India. Again, he called out their hypocrisy. And another interesting thing is that America has never called out China because China was the number one buyer has been the number one buyer of Russian oil. Never said anything to China, but only to India, putting pressure on India. What is the strategy behind that?
I think they do complain about China, but they haven't tried to punish China as they did India, precisely because China can fight back. See, India's problem here with the Trump tariffs and the threats and all that is that India has a huge trade surplus with the United States.
Yeah.
And so does China, by the way, but China provides critical things to the United States, like rare earth metals that are absolutely indispensable for high-tech industry in the United States. And when Trump started, leveling these tariffs against China, if you follow it, I don't follow it very closely. It's not really my main area of work, but I read the news. Trump backed off very quickly when the Chinese shut down the flow of rare earth metal exports to the United States. There was a moment there where China struck back and Trump backed down. And the talks that are going on with China now are much, much more careful because China can do some serious damage to the U.S. economy.
Yeah.
If it retaliates. It can, it's not just that, it holds a lot of U.S. Treasury bills, like $1 trillion or more.
Yeah, and they can spoil the Christmas also.
They cash them in tomorrow, the U.S. dollar would tank. Like, you want to treat China really carefully. Whereas India, I'm sorry to say, it doesn't export anything that the Americans can't do without. And it's at the mercy of the United States in a lot of ways that China is.
Yeah, China has been very smart that way. So that's pretty much it for today. And friends, please do like, share, and subscribe. Mr. Weir has shared some wonderful information with us. So I'll see you soon, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
And enjoy your travel.
Okay, yes.
And I look forward to reading
the holidays till the end of January.
Okay. So we'll be in touch and we'll meet soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.